About microservices today, and for the most part, most developers can forget all about microservices. They're just there and they work. They've got a few bugs. There's not too many of them out there. Conceptually, a microservice is just a small specialized program that does something to back up your just to kind of farm out some of the tasks. So you can put them on specialized servers that do those tasks a little bit better. You can queue them up. They work in the background. Most of our installations, the overwhelming majority of our installations, in fact, probably pushing up on 99%, all the microservices services are run from the same server. But there's no need for that. You can farm those out anywhere and you can share them. So if you've got a dev staging and production environment, you can use the same OCR engine. You can split them up. You can share them around. The idea is just gets them out of this immediate context, so you can use them as needed. So you can put them on any server. We tend to write ours in the original ones were Silex. They're mostly been upgraded to Symfony now. But they don't have to be PHP. You can write them in any language. You could, in fact, we were talking about one at the library last night that we might do in Python. It's just any language that can receive a RESTful and fire out a RESTful request is good enough. So there's a uniformity. We have a lot of our microservices are very similar, but they don't have to be. It's just they're written by the same crew. Everybody writes in the language that they're most comfortable with. So you may think just because you see the same structure in 3 different microservices that it's important, and it's not. For the most part, one I can think of, the exception would be the text extraction. We make it does 2 different jobs. So that will run Tesseract on images and will run PDF to text on PDF. So it extracts text in both cases. But for the most part, it does one job. The image one, it depends on what arguments you fire out as to whether you get a service file or a thumbnail back, but it's kind of the same job. So the current microservices deal with audio, video, images, and the subset of that is the thumbnails. We do fits, we do text extraction, we do fixity checks, and we do Bagged integration. And there may be others out there in the wild that people are using that I'm not aware of. They're out there, their work. Yeah, that's really all we need to say about that. Services necessary, and the answer is no. It is our standard. I think without exception, everything we do in a microservice, we could do in a hook if we wanted to. In fact, when I was writing the PDF text extraction, I did all that in a hook just because it's easier to debug and keep track of everything, make sure I was getting the results I wanted. Then took the exact same functionality, pushed it out to a controller in a Symfony application. So you're not obliged to use this if you have derivatives that you want to create, especially if they're specific to your particular use case. Not a reason on earth you can't write a module and have that do the same thing. It's just where you're going to put your code. There's advantages and disadvantages to microservices, mostly related around queuing, and I'm going to talk a bit about the way we do the queuing now. And then Kyle is doing some really excellent work with another way of looking at things that actually covers up a lot of the deficiencies of the way we're doing it now. So with a microservice, as you're writing one, as you're developing it, there's a whole lot of steps involved. So you have to define an action and you have to instantiate that action. And this is something I wish they'd done the language a little bit differently. Like you have a content type and then you create a content type so you know what you're building. So an action isn't necessarily an action. You just have to determine it from context, but then context has another meaning as well that we'll also talk about. So then you have to define the condition under which this will fire. And we've got, there's a whack of them that are already written in code. You may have to create a new condition. It's becoming less and less likely. Right now, your condition, so this would be what condition what condition or set of conditions have to be met before the action is triggered. So it could, generally, it's just if you have a media that's going in, which is identified as being original file, then we want stuff to happen. But you can also trigger it, so if it's a child of, if it has a parent of this type, if it's got this MIME type, you can figure it out. And these are all plugins. We talked about plugins the other day when Nigel and Seth were doing their talk, and plugins everywhere. So they're not particularly difficult to write. You have that condition, and then it becomes available. So once you have that condition, then you have to define a context, and the context is done entirely through the UI. And when you go into the context, that's when you give it the rules. So it says, if this happens, and if this happens, and if this happens, then make this happen. And it's fairly transparent and not all that difficult to set up. And if you set it up wrong, nobody's going to die. You can go back and change it again pretty easily. And as a debugging tip, this is something that'll come up from time to time. Somebody will wonder why their derivatives are not being produced. So if you go in and you grab that node and you manually trigger that action and you get what you want, then it's got to be the context. Yikes. Thank you. And then that context is triggered. And then once the context is triggered, so at this point you've defined your action, you've instantiated your action, you've set up the context. So we know for a fact that we want this derivative to be created at that point. So now the request goes out to the microservice, and that request is queued. And when your time comes up, when there's space, that request is dispatched, and it goes to the microservice, and the microservice then gets information, and it comes in. It's just a REST call. So it will tell the microservice how to get that asset, if in fact you need the asset. And as far as I know, for all our microservices, you do. So you've got that. At that point, your microservice program, which is tiny, these things tend to be just 1 or 2 methods, will grab that asset and it will do something with it. So it will extract the text, it'll get the fits, in the fits case is kind of interesting because it doesn't actually get the fits. What it does is that it takes the asset and then fires it off to a web service, which is, again, it's controlled in there. We tend to use our own web service, but you could use the public one, doesn't matter. So it fires it off, gets it back. Then once it has a response, if it likes it, it sends it back to Drupal, and then Drupal does stuff with it by processing that response. Where this gets weak, and this is something that Kyle's work will address, is this is all kind of stateless. So you fire it out, and all Drupal knows at that point is a request has been issued. That's all it knows. And then when a response comes in, all it knows is the response comes in. It doesn't link those two. It has no idea. So if something breaks along the way, there's nothing within the microservice framework currently that says, the request we sent out, yeah, well, nah. We don't have that. So that's one of the breakdowns of it, and I've worked at different logging processes, and this kind of went by that. So it's a deficiency in the system that you absolutely have to be aware of. So as you're running, I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here. So as we're running through this, the first thing that you have to do is create an action in code if there's not one that exists for you already. So from that, you're establishing a number of different parameters. So it's what event, and in this case, it's normally derivative creation. And then you decide what arguments should be sent along to that. Most of the time, that's nothing at all. If you're making a thumbnail, then you're giving it the dimensions of the thumbnail and whatnot. But the important things here are that's going is you tell it the source URI. So you said, this is where you go to get your original asset. The destination URI is where you're going to send it back to. And this is super important because that's your RESTful endpoint that you've set up in Drupal. So for instance, when we were doing the media attach, so this takes a file and attaches it to an existing media instead of creating a new one. We needed a whole new endpoint for that. So with that endpoint, we had to say, this is the ID of the media that you need to attach it to. this is the file point that you need to mount it to. So we send this information out. And because this goes out in the request and it comes back, Drupal does not track this for you while it's gone. This is part of the message that goes out. And then you say the MIME type of whatever's being returned. So as that comes back, then your endpoint can decide whether it's able to deal with that MIME type or not. Once you've created that action, then you have to instantiate it. And that's done entirely through config. So you're going to go in through the admin interface, through config system, which isn't necessarily the first place you'd guess. Then you come to actions, and then you've got the drop down of the actions that you've already created. And you say, give me one of those, and then it pops up a form, and you configure it to your particular use case. And then you define the condition, and we talked about that just a second ago. And here's some of the conditions that we can filter for already. So you've got the MIME type, you've got the parental content type, you've got size, you've got taxonomy term. So is this taxonomy term attached to it? If so, do this. If you're a collection membership, so you can absolutely set up a condition. If you're a member of this collection, I want you to do this. That might be derivative collection, but it's a creation, but it's unlikely. It's more likely you're going to use that to have a custom display. Microservice, but we are talking about conditions. And then there's the bundle, and Nick Rouet just discovered this the other day, is that bundles aren't a thing anymore. They've been defined differently as of 9.4. So if any of you have microservices that aren't working anymore, check your conditions. You may have to change that. Sample code here. I'm not sure if that will bring it up. Oh, this was one that I wrote some time ago. I think I wrote it for media source has MIME type. So this is when you're going back and you're looking at the source media, said if it has this MIME type, then do this. If it has another MIME type, do that. So it's just a condition. And I won't trouble you by looking through the code too much here, but you can just see that everything, there's very little code here. Setting up the conditions that if this condition is met, it's all down here in the form evaluate, it either returns true or false. It's when you're defining this action, this is when you put the queue in, and we don't have a good way. You kind of have to know what the queue is. You have to look it up. So we've got a queue that goes through Carafe, or the new alpaca jar doesn't use Carafe anymore. But in any case, you still need to know, the controller needs to know where to send this, and that's the queue name. And you just have to know those. Those are available in the code. I think there's an argument to maybe we have to maintain a list of those and make that available throughout the UI. But that's just something you have to do. And how did this happen? Yeah, this is exactly what we're talking about. We've set up the context, and as again, we've said the actions can be manually triggered, which is a good way to test. Also something that you're going to do in bulk quite often, set up a VBO, which is views bulk operations. Use a view to filter whatever you want. So pick out everything that has anything that can be filtered in any way, put up the VBO, and then from that, then you can fire off your derivative creation or indexing or whatever you'd like. But once the request goes out to the microservice, you've defined the action, you've instantiated the action, the context is defined, and then the context is triggered. So that's how you've taken it to the point that it's going to go out. Just queued. So right now, the default implementation is using Carafe, which has it's either built into the server if you've built it in using the playbook, or it has its own. It has its its own container in Drupal. You can go in and you can manage the client, and there's actually a view from Craft that you can go in and you can manage that queue. But the new single service server Alpaca jar is out there, which runs without that. And Seth, I think you know about that, don't you? Speaking to the mic.
So when Drupal emits the message, it emits it to ActiveMQ or whatever queue service you have set up. And then Carafe and now Alpaca would watch that queue for any messages that need to be claimed and then processed. So now instead of using Carafe, we just tell Alpaca in its configuration where ActiveMQ is and which queues to look at for a particular microservice.
And where is that config set?
So it's in an Alpaca config file.
Perfect.
Yep.
All right, thanks. So these are things that are changing, and I love Carafe when it works, and I really hate it when it doesn't. But it did have the advantage, and I think we've lost this, is you used to be able to go into the client, and from the client you could run queries, and you could look at logs, and you could turn things on, you could turn things off. Didn't do it all that often, and probably not that important a feature, because I'm going to say 90% of Drupal developers don't even know it's there. We've lost that, but it's a queue system that works. So the request is then dispatched to the microservice that you've previously defined in that configuration, along with the options, and then you get the and again, this works only in the if you're using Carafe. You've got a blueprint XML file. And the blueprint XML, I think I've got one here. No. Blueprint XML just defines some parameters. It gives you the address of the microservice that this is going out to. Whoa, what happened here? I wonder if I've lost. Oh, there we're back again. Thank you. Here's the turnaround. Is your microservice is going to receive that request object, and it gets the assets from the request parameters. So it pulls back, and I say that's normally the asset that you're examining, and there may be exceptions that it doesn't have to do that, but that's the normal thing. So if you had a microservice, for instance, and all it was going to do is send back a licensing agreement, and that would be a stupid way to do it. But if you did it, it wouldn't actually need the original asset. So then it applies its own logic, and right now, as far as I know, all the microservices take the arguments literally, which is kind of how most arguments start, and we'll take that argument and pass it off to whatever executable you're using. But there is no reason you couldn't take that argument and then have logic within your microservice to parse that out. So you could say, if this condition is met, I want you to do that, as long as it's a way of sending along flags. So just an optional way of sending information along. Then it's going to create that derivative, and then it returns that derivative as a response object. So this is what your routing looks like. So this is going back to a route, and this is just an example. So this is the one for the text extraction attached to media, and this is what I was talking about when you're setting up your endpoint. So the path, and this is one that you could send this from Postman. You could send it from. This is the way we supply it. But in this case, we've got media, add OCR, which sort of tells Drupal, we kind of want you to add some OCR to this media. Anything in curly brackets has been tokenized. So we're going to give you the media ID, the mid, is going to be passed there. Then we're going to give you the destination field, because generally, if you're creating your own media, you already know what the destination field is going to be. But if you're adding to, then you have to define that field so it knows where to put it. We do not have standardized multi-file media. I don't think we ever should. You're going to start with immediate. You're going to add those. You're going to add file fields that you want, and they can be interpreted as they go. And then there's the destination text field, and we do that because there's for OCR there's two fields. There's one we're going to attach the file, then we're going to attach the actual text, which at that point can be edited and can be indexed. So there's kind of a lot going on, and this is something that the standard endpoint wouldn't do. But writing a new endpoint isn't a great big deal. You can see it's just got the default set up there, the requirements, authorization types. It's not trivial, but it's especially if you've got an example to follow, it's not a great big deal. So we don't use a whole lot of endpoints, but they're easy to write and they're easy to maintain. Oh, and this is the blueprint. So this is the XML that goes into Carafe, and I presume for Alpaca, you're looking at pretty much the same type XML input?
It's a YAML, but it's the same property.
Same thing, sure. Okay, so here this is just namespacing it, and I'm guessing that's gone because that's a pretty Java-ish namespace. You're telling it how many times to retry. Be careful with the retries. In my experience, if it failed the first time, it's going to fail the second time. But it has to think about it. So if you've got something that's not going to work, all you've done is clog up and if you've got a 90-second turnaround time, you've now clogged up the queue for 5 minutes for absolutely no reason. So we default to 5. I set mine to 1 on some, and occasionally you have to go higher just because people are being stubborn, but it either works or it doesn't work. And then this is the queue name, and this is the name that you need to plug into the configuration file. And we have a convention, so they're all pretty similar. They're not stored anywhere as far as I know. You got to know someone. It's something we could probably do a little bit better. And honestly, I think the situation is we have so few microservices. Kind of exposing this and making it a little bit easier is going to take up more developer time than it's going to save when it's done. Then this is the important one, is where are you going to send this? And we've been burned on this a few times before, where people have done something in development and then they realize they're using a totally different URL when it goes out into prod, and it doesn't work anymore, and you don't know why. And this is a good place to look. Oh, a few notes down here. The persistent ID is a Java naming convention, and it can be anything. This is just a good way of making sure that you're not stomping on your own toes. And the queue is the queue name that you defined in the action, so you have to maintain that the whole way through. And just the web address of the microservice. Then the response is returned. And Carafe receives the response object and it fires it off to the URI that you sent along in the first place. It's been keeping track of that the whole time. And then it goes to the destination URI, and the destination URI is a route to a controller. And either it works or it doesn't. So you send it back. Sort of a real common thing is you'll see something that says it's come back with the wrong MIME type, and you've set the MIME type up and you have no idea what you've done wrong. And what's happened, it's returned an error message in HTML. So it's saying, no, we don't handle HTML, and we don't expect it to, but the error messages you get are not necessarily the ones you were hoping for. So again, this is the breakdown in the situation, in the cycle. It can be a little bit difficult to monitor. So if things are not working for you, check your logs. You can just do a Docker log if you're running in a containerized environment, or you can find the logs actually within the microservice if you're running on a more conventional build. So check there first, and the obvious one that people forget for some reason is go into your Drupal site, go into reports, go into recent error messages, and you'll often see what the problem is. We run into this workbench all the time. Workbench broke. No, it didn't. Just look in, you tried to give it the wrong kind of file. But then the response is received by Drupal. It gets the object headers tells you exactly where the content is located, because what we've done is this Carafe will take the file that it's created and it will stick it somewhere for you. but then we have to know what to do with that saved file. So the file is actually saved on your system right now. It's just not incorporated in a Drupal node. So this is what you have to do when you're writing your handler. When it comes in, is you have to grab that. And then, as I say here, you've got the NID, you've got the MID, whatever it is you need to do that. And then you build your object from that, and you can try it. And you're kind of back in the driver's seat again. You know what's going on. So it's a little easier to deal with at that point. But again, there is this break, which, especially when you're debugging, can be a problem. Oh, that's kind of it from cradle to grave. It's about what's happened so far before Kyle tells you a better way of doing all this. It's just a whole lot of moving parts. None of them are particularly onerous, but it's not like writing a microservice is just part of it. The other part that didn't really go into is for almost all derivatives, you then have to write a module what to do with that derivative when it comes in. So we've got a text extraction module, we've got a fits module. So for instance, fits, when it comes in, you've created this node, but now what? So then you need the whole fits module to show, when I did that one, I had to write a custom display for it. I had to write some custom fields for it, set up some, I can't remember, no, I don't think I used, did I use a tweak template? I can't remember. But you have to create a view. So you've got this back, but you've just got raw data at that point that has to be processed. So a full microservice is not something you're going to write in a day. You can probably do it in a week, but it's going to be a lot of work, and it's not going to be very good at the end of the week. It's going to take you another 3 weeks to figure out everything you did wrong in the first 2 weeks. So I think that's kind of covered it. And this is, for most developers, this isn't really going to make any difference. What was the last new microservice we had? Can anybody?
Probably Crayfits.
Yeah, and I did Crayfits 3 years ago.
Yeah, something like that.
So there may be other use cases, and this is pretty much all the logic that used to be encapsulated in the derivative creation that we had in 7. You used to be able to do your derivatives in a day. You can't anymore. So there's it's another disadvantage of the microservice. It should make your system more performant, and it should not clog up your whole system while you're waiting for stuff that you don't need right now. So for instance, when I'm doing Workbench, which I use for most of my ingest now, if I'm running, I don't really like to go much. I have done batch ingest of over 20,000 objects in a spreadsheet, but I don't really like to go much over 5,000. But if you have images, you can do 5,000, and that's going to have your queues clogged up for a day, day and a half. But it doesn't stop the system. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question on that front. Collection of Docker containers, the microservices that can respond to these. Actually scaling up the microservices. Idea of either parallel transactions would be able to throw higher and higher amounts.
Oh, what Gavin was just asking about was scalability, and whether you have exactly one microservice working with exactly one host. And I think there's been some work done with Kubernetes, firing it out to different servers. You've got a couple of different things on the go here, and it's an excellent question, and I think there's just going to be a whole lot of trial and error on this. So I don't see any reason you couldn't have a dozen microservices producing those derivatives, but you've still just got the one endpoint that they all come back to. So that could swamp that system a little bit. As far as I know, it's just a single queue, although I would defer to Luke on that.
What I did is I set up a
Come up and speak into the mic, Luke.
Hi, so this is Luke Taylor. I was just going to mention I did a proof of concept system where I broke the stack completely apart. In my case, I was doing it in EC2 and I was using auto scaling groups within Amazon. So I actually kept the microservices stack on one EC2 instance with Carafe, and I made it so that they would auto scale based on CPU load. And they were all feeding off of Amazon MQ, which was separate. And the database was in Aurora serverless. And the nodes were all in, also in an auto scaling group. So like the front end nodes, all the Drupal, and basically the sites directory was kept in EFS, and that was attached to all the nodes. And with Solar, I use Solar Cloud with Zookeeper, and each of those were in an auto-scaling group. And the challenge of that is that they had to know about each other as they spun up, and that's where Puppet came in. They were talking to Puppet, and it would update it. I didn't get really past the proof of concept stage because I haven't had a huge use case for it yet, but I can see it happening in the near future. Actually, I had a slide in it from my presentation tomorrow where I was going to talk more about it. I don't want to talk about it because I could talk about it for a long time.
Awesome.
So yeah, anyways, I did it, but in my case, it wasn't Kubernetes. It was just basic EC2 and with AMIs with like the stack set up on them. Yeah, but I don't know if you had any questions about that.
That sounds great.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, I'll be talking about it more tomorrow.
Luke Taylor, ladies and gentlemen. Yep.
Yeah, I'll comment a little bit about as well how we've seen it set up. Currently, the Drupal config only has one address for emitting messages to. And I don't know about scaling the queue, but the queue is relatively fast anyway.
It never jams.
Yeah,
That's
never
never
jams.
your
It's
problem.
never the queue's fault unless it's been turned off, right?
Yeah.
The jam has been with ActiveMQ and not ActiveMQ with Alpaca and the microservices. To that point though, you can have Alpaca. It's also relatively quick itself. The challenge is how quickly can your crayfish respond, and that you can also throw in front of a load balancer, and you can tell Alpaca, I want to send max consumers 15. You can have 15 Houdini running if you want, and then fire off to the load balancer, and it'll do 15 at a time. It doesn't care. What will matter is your Drupal end receiving all those derivatives back at the same time.
Yeah.
That's the scale issue that really has not been addressed yet.
The load balancer, you can.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, no, just
But yeah, in theory.
in theory. Great.
Yeah, we should be able to, and it's important to remember that that the queue sends requests out and it gets requests back, but it doesn't connect the two of them, right? So it's you could actually send it back to a different queue if you're not of sound mind.
No, I actually think Alan and I would contest that. That's actually my whole point of microservices. Is
Yeah.
so it's like, think of like a bigger Voltron. sort of to build on what Luke was saying, is you a whole bunch of clustered services in AWS or serverless or, you know.
Oh, absolutely could. No, I'm just saying that the ActiveMQ that sends the request out is the same bit of code that gets it back, but it doesn't connect the. It's all it knows is something came in.
Yep.
So you could theoretically pull from one queue and stick it back in another, but it's as you say that the queue is never where it jams. It's never where it gets sticky. So that's pretty quick. The most part I think is reasonably performant with incoming stuff, but I mean rest just takes time. It's not a super fast way of doing anything. As these come in, something this is kind of related to this. It came up in the migration talk. With microservices, as your queue gets longer and longer, from the time something was added to the queue to the time something comes off, there can be quite a gap. It can be days, but it's gone in with the same JWT that was created at the time. So within Islandora, it's super simple. You can you change the timeout on your JWT. I think out of the box, it's really low. It's like an hour and a half or something. So I said that I set mine to 2 days, and Danny said he sets his to 2 months. So, you know, just, I don't want to think about it. So just make sure your JWT is, the timing on that is set for the longest you can imagine running a queue. And I'm doing a migration for a library in the States, and we've got everything set up. We're going to be kicking it off any day now. We think it's going to be somewhere around a 35-day batch job running. So just chug away in the background. So we're going to set the queues on that very high. And as I've mentioned before, the danger is if it's too short, it doesn't just clean out that queue. It just doesn't say, nope, 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 nope. Say, hey, let me try again. Let me try again. And that will keep that up forever and clog your queues. And unless you can get in and manually clean out that queue, you've got an unusable system, could be for days. And these things for the Docker's users, the queue will survive a reset. So you can't just take it down and put it back up again. Jim? What's the address for that? There's you can expose that in the build, and you can specify it there. Yeah, I think 8161 is the, and I don't use it very often, but exposes the queue, tells you what's there, and you can kill it if something's slowing it down.
Nigel was mentioning that there's a command line tool for actually viewing messages, which I have no experience.
I think he had a CLI command that you could kill the queue.
Yeah, that and it could view messages as well.
Yeah. No, if you tail the logs from the microservice, it will at least let you know what's being fired off and whether it's getting a reasonable response or not. Something that will happen, I think it's happening less now, but you get timeouts on really big files because they were set for 1.5 minutes, and I think we bumped that up a bit. So if you're dealing with a big video file, it's just not going to make it. And again, they're going to try 5 times before they say, sorry, Bubs. Yeah.
To be able to accommodate that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And what was the one we had with, it was meant to make it more performant, but we were running 5 different instances of Tesseract on the same microservice, which you couldn't really tell if you're consuming your snacks one at a time. But in batch processing, it would try to do 5 at the same time. Because Tesseract uses about 85% of the resources, if you have more than one process running, it goes from taking about 20 seconds a page to taking about 3 minutes a page. So be careful what you wish for sometimes. So I think that's been turned off since, and it's because I haven't had an issue with that for a while. One of the things that we talk about in this whole process of actions and microservices for migration, sometimes it's a really good idea just to turn that off because you don't want that happening at the time. And then you can selectively go through and do groups later. Seth?
This is what we did at UNLV.
Yeah.
We completely turned off the context
Yeah.
for derivatives. We don't have one at all. Instead, we have cron jobs that will look for missing derivatives and fire them off then in relatively smaller batches as we have seen we can handle in time.
I think we toyed around with the idea at one point of kind of lazy loading. So just say, I'm looking for this derivative. It's not there. Could you make it for me now? I'll wait. And then it's there for the next person who needs it. And ultimately it turned out to be, again, more work, created more work than it prevented. So didn't go anywhere with that. But it is something to think about, especially on larger installations, as things they can get a little bit out of hand. And I think, Rosie, you've done some work with thumbnails and the Drupal automatic thumbnails as opposed to having the microservices create them.
Yeah, so probably like using Drupal with its like image, sort of in. With the basic Drupal built-in image, you can throw in like a fairly large image file, like a JPEG, and then Drupal automatically turns it into, your 100 by 100 thumbnail or your 400 by 400 medium size or whatever on the fly. It kind of stores those files in its like image styles directory, and it's part of that special media source that's built into the image media type image file, I guess. So like Drupal already has a derivative process, and we could probably use it in a lot of cases where right now, we're sending stuff out to microservices. If it doesn't take too long, the file's already there. It would save us all the time of shipping files back and forth. And I don't actually have an opinion about that, like doing it on the fly as you are requesting it versus making them all ahead of time. So you've got this kind of complete object. But Drupal's way has worked for them. And I think it would definitely work for the kind of service filey, thumbnail-y stuff that you don't care about preserving.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, that is something that's not related to any of this at all, but how we sort of value our content. And I never get too bugged out about preserving anything you can rebuild. I think it's just a service file, fits thumbnail, who cares? If it doesn't work, build a new one. It's not a problem. Your original data, there's only one. I think I kind of, another question, Annette?
Related to the microservices, as Alex pointed out in his presentation, for certain, I guess for large files, microservices, Alex noted that it may be not such a good idea.
Oh yeah, it's a terrible idea.
Maybe if you could speak to that a little bit, where, in which use cases we should, maybe have some alternate way of handling it.
Yeah, there is a condition, and I don't know if anyone uses it or not, but there is a condition for file size. So you could set up, I think, if not, you could certainly write the condition that say if a file is over a certain size, then just don't. And you could come up with some other way of processing it, because this is a way of creating. We call them derivative files because they are derived from the original, but as far as Drupal is concerned, it's just another media with just another tag on it. So there's nothing to stop you from uploading an extracted text file. There's nothing to stop you from uploading your own FITS file, if you've got one. So yeah, just think about what it is that you're doing. You might, I think there's, especially in a lot of video files, there's a strong argument to exempting those from the FITS process. Because FITS in particular, and I've been thinking about rewriting this for years, and I've been thinking about a lot of stuff for years that doesn't happen, but this is one of them. So the programmatic flow to get a couple of K of data out of a video file, which could be megs or gigs long, I suppose. As that gets fired out to the microservice, the microservice then takes the entire file and fires it out to a web service. So it's already been handled 3 times, and then the results come back. So there's probably a better way of extracting that data, I'll talk to repository managers who didn't even know Fitz was there. I mean, we do it because it's cheap. We can throw, yeah, sure, I can do that for you. It's a little lagniappe that we kind of throw onto the pile. But for the most part, Fitz data isn't extremely useful for most applications. There might be something that you want from, but there might not. So if you're going to be consuming a lot of resources, I mean, that is a good example of what we're talking about, of having it not triggered by context. Say, if you really want it, push this button and we'll get it for you. But we're not really sure it's all that necessary. Gavin?
A good question the gentleman prior to me just asked is, this is something that I would also invite the community to think about, is it's like having the right tool for the right job. There's like a sort of cost fallacy that comes into play here, where essentially the microservices are like an amazing Swiss Army knife of different things that you can do. But in terms of context, like sending a several gigabyte video file or, that's the wrong way of thinking of it. It's not the right tool. Your tiny EC2 server, by, order of operations, it's going to take days or weeks to load something. And if you're doing that on a production server, guess what? You're not using. So what I would invite those on the call and in this room to think about services, which is not by any way of me. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm inviting people to think about is start using the right tools for the right job. Are there APIs like in cloud services where like AWS transcode or whatever Jeff Bezos calls it these days, the idea that you look up that API and you send and manage files through a microservice that could, trigger that API, and then boom, in a matter of minutes, because you're using scale. You're using like free CPU, free transcoding. The codecs will be better. You'll have better interfaces. Essentially, the tool will be perfect for it. That's easier said than done, of course. Someone has to go and translate all of those specs into a and Docker container and so on and so forth. That would be the better direction rather than trying to recreate it. Still getting very diminished results because you can't leverage any more than the amount of CPU and RAM and so on your server. So I think, to me, we're in space, we're floating around Earth, but we really need to start landing on the moon, and we need to going to Mars. And in my opinion, a lot of that is decoupling ISLE, being able to bring in a lot of services that Luke was hinting at with, just in particular Amazon, many of others that are equally as good. Start thinking about scale and how when you go to your manager and say, I need X amount of compute, you're talking about hours versus days. Mm-hmm. And in fact, most times, those kinds of budgets, what I would refer to as burst services, you're going to get a manager who's going to say, yeah, I'll pay $100 because OCR is readable. Instead of, hey, we're going to spend 500 FTEs to make this thing work on a tiny server. I mean, it's a cost fallacy. So I think if we start thinking larger and bigger moonshots.
Point. Thanks, Gavin.
I guess just a reference there, somebody.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what Luke has just mentioned is that they're making an effort to make it easier to swap out microservices. So we don't necessarily use Tesseract. We can use some of the other fields that are available, and that is essentially the essence of microservices. It's you pick the action, you pick the context. So if there's not a reason on earth you couldn't write your own engine and use that instead of Tesseract/Hypercube, and it would be fine, and it'd be easy to drop in. That is one of the big advantages of microservices, is that they're really granular, and you either use them or you don't use them. But so we've had some excellent questions, and I'm hoping there'll be some time for more general questions at the end. But I'd really like Kyle to give us all a rundown on the work he's been doing lately with advanced Drupal queues. I'll put you in the driver's seat.
Thank you. Approach a little bit different. So at UTSC, we actually stack a little bit lighter. We didn't use Fedora, for example, as we mentioned in the morning presentation. We also remove some of the Java application base like Carafe, Apache, Advanced MQ, and we do for queuing system we need like user interface to actually monitor like the error messages for the microservice jobs, and we would like to have those basic feature of the queue, for example, automatically run and retry all the failed jobs, for example. Sorry, that's when we actually come across advanced queue module. So basically, it's a Drupal module built in PHP. It have have a user interface which is monitor all the job state. For example, you can see in the screenshot, so like how many job is queue, how many job is processing, success and fail. It can rerun the job if it fail, and for running the queue, we can run it in the Drush command or Drupal console command, or you can attach to a Drupal cron job to do it. So this is a link for the modules. So to assist our approach, we have to develop a few more additional modules. It's an advanced queue runner, Drupal store indexer, and the fits. So the advanced queue runner is basically its assistant for the advanced queue. So the job is to demonize the Drush command line, which is run the advanced queue in the background. There's a discussion on the Anandra issue channel. I think Diego was suggesting like we can demonize the Drush command line by using the framework called React PHP, and we look into it and we implement two of their component, which is child process and event loop. So basically, it's the advanced queue is basically it's running the infinite loop, and then each loop execute the Drush command line, which is triggering the queue. If the queue have any job on it, it will run the queue. Otherwise, we ignore and go to the next wait. So this is the link to the Drupal, the module. So we actually don't use the Anandra core modules, and so we have to develop the module for indexing RDF formatter of the node, which is generated by the JSON-LD module to the place graph. So that's when a Drupal store index module come in place. Pretty straightforward module. Basically, just do the REST call and send the RDF format to the place graph. So all the indexing job actually take place in the hooks. For example, like insert, update, and delete. And we also have implement the action, which is you can find it in the admin dash content page, list of nodes in the admin side. I think that's all. So for the fit, we actually develop. This is one of microservices relate to derivative generation, which is technical metadata. So this module it actually work with advanced queue, and can work with the fit setup like the web services or the Linux command, which is it come with the fit tools. So basically, we make decision to actually have our metadata, technical metadata, in the file level, and then that when the file entity suitable file module, which is come in place. We also want to preserve the technical metadata original version into in the file level as well. So we use the module called JSON field module. So basically, it will generate the JSON field, which is we store all the technical metadata in JSON format into that field, and then that can result. And we use a JavaScript library called gemspath.php to extract the metadata into a field, so that we can index to Blazecraft or Solar if we want to. Again, the indexing also, the action also triggering from the hooks. And it can be manually activate in the list of the file in the backend, in the admin side. So how to integrate the microservice job with advanced queue? It's pretty straightforward. It's just like implementing the job type base, which is provided by the advanced queue module. As you can see, just with the declaring of the machine name and the label. We have to override some of the delegate function, and also we can code. We can actually code to determine the success or fail of the jobs. And with this approach, with this kind of implementation, we can extend it to some of the microservices. Work with advanced queue if we want to. That's right now we have two microservices like the indexing and fit to work with this approach. But in the future, we might want to expand that in the future as well. So I attached the link to where the tutorial, the article, which is describe how to actually integrate to the advanced queue jobs. Yeah. So what next for our approach is we need to really test on scalability, which as we mentioned. Right now, I think the site we have is I think it's like the 2,000 or 3,000 objects we're ingesting. For triple index, we need to test it a little bit more. We found a little bit, there's an issue on the multilingual compatibilities. So we need to fix that for the triple indexer modules. So we package our demo, our approach into like a demo. This could be in the IDC or the playbook with the sample content. Yeah, so that's pretty much my our approach. Any question, feedback? Please email.
That's great, Kyle. What's the longest queue you've ever run?
Good question. I would say, since we just tested in like really light stack, so I would say like for the longest one is for the fit. So when if it run the request to web service, it's really quick. But if it run like if we do like a fit Linux command, it might take a little bit. So it probably like a minute. That's what I remember. I'm not quite sure at this moment.
Oh, you get.
So if I mentioned like so running Linux command usually like I take like a 1 minute, right? 10 seconds. 10 seconds. Sorry.
Okay, but you haven't sort of stacked up a couple of thousand objects or? in your queue at the same time?
Stack up, yeah.
You know, because what I'm talking about with the queue system we're using now,
Right.
you can have like literally 5 or 6 days worth of stuff backed up in it. And so it's, as far as I know, the back end on this is all database, so it should be able to handle a virtually infinite number.
That's what we're not sure yet.
All
So
right.
we tested like 1,000 objects. We haven't tested more than that. Yeah. So.
Am I right in my understanding that Advanced Queue wraps the Drupal core queue API, right?
Yeah, it's using the
Yeah.
Drupal.
I've used the core queue API without Advanced Runner for well over 1,000 objects. I think it was like 15.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super quick. Yeah. The holdup is how long it takes, something like just fine.
Awesome.
And message. In terms of message count, it's fine.
Server in the backend, when the files are there in the server network, I can just run it remotely from a different server. Hey, I'm done. 10,000 items done. Like we're going not 100 items, 200 items at a time.
It's quite long. You want to talk about that?
Come up and summarize that for the folks at home
You're an expert on that.
on what they've won.
So for a standard Drupal site and a standard server is, you see queue server or anything similar, the queue should be, up to 10,000 easy. Only thing you have to do is like when fit's running in the command line, you have to have enough temp space on the server so it doesn't run out of space. So usually I did a rough calculation first ahead, just to see, okay, each file should be this much, so I can run 10,000, I need this much, the storage is allocated. So they're all fine. So a lot of things they're running on active, the queue running advanced queue. And some of the things, for example, all the, we don't use Tesseract, we use Google Vision. So I have a separate backend server. They're all connected to the same storage backend. And I just run a different process from here. It picks up from same folder, drops it to the same folder, right? And then they can pick it up from there and go. So eventually we'll all integrate all together as if, right now it's in beta stage. So we have kind of working model, but soon we will actually start putting things together. So I have to spend more time looking over it. Kind of runs automatic, only complains when it's failing. That's when I look at it. That's all.
Do you have any challenges with input and output on like certain disk types, or do you just use like SSD and
All SSD, our servers are basically managed by the IT division. So that's where I come in. I work half here, half there. So whenever they're working on a project, they give me a heads up and I just check out, okay, storage space required, CPU power required, what I assess and I allocate as needed, and let them do what their magic, and they get stuck somewhere. Then we do whatever need to be done to get things done.
But would you have any advice for the folks at home, like certain types of setup? I mean, what you're describing sounds pretty elaborate, and I'm just curious if there are any gotchas that you might have experienced when you were setting that up.
Storage is main thing because let's say we have 10 sites and each of them are looking at at the same time, they're all looking at JPEG 2 files, the source. And a lot of times we get hit by these auto indexers that hits our side at the same time in the middle of the night, right? Necessarily, drawing up all these things. So I start blocking them at some point. Then I said, well, I do want the indexing, so let's not block them, allow some of it. But that's when the background process is basically the storage allocation is enough there, so you don't run out of it, right? The CPU, so everything's on VMware. So yeah, it's all dynamic. Like we set up, minimum 2 CPUs up to 10, scale as needed, things like that. So anybody who has access to that sort of thing, I would say definitely do that. If not, you just have to make sure that whatever queue, your limits of the memory queue and the CPU power, and just try to make sure that all the things that are happening within that, otherwise it will break at some point, it will be overwhelming. So that's all at this point I can share.
So I'm curious, when you're generating
That's when they're doing all the ingest. So in their ingest process, they're all located, this is where all the files are. No, it's not automatically attaching yet, right? So that's when they're doing ingest. I think we just finished like 1,000 ingest recently, like with the tourist side. So next one, the biggest one is coming up with Ganda side that will have over 100,000 objects. So that's when we will really test out the max we can, work with. So that's the project I think we'll be working on sometime in October, maybe. So I'm just gearing up the back end. Everything is in process. So that's when we'll know the performance, how far we can go.
Excellent.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Excellent input. Comments? It looks like we're finishing early. Well, thanks everybody. If there's any questions, we've talked about these a few times in the past. I think we're at the point now that we're tweaking existing services. I don't think there's anything out there with current technology. I would love a microservice where we could go file off and get a transcript back. And I know that there's been a couple of attempts at that, but I don't think there's anything that's super usable right now. Kind of would. Microsoft had one, but it was web-based only and their website only, and no API. It was you could do them one by each, so it was more of an experiment than anything else. And it ought to be doable. I mean, we've got one that does pretty reliable text-to-speech. Mightn't be awesome, but it's not bad.
I'm pretty sure every podcaster has knowledge of what the automatic stuff. So it might be like one file at a time.
Yeah.
There's actually one bit of software, I can't remember off the top of my head, that is, but no. I'll look it up and post it somewhere. My wife doesn't.
Okay.
We got 3-year-olds drinking.
And there was one that I'd seen, it was a bit experimental, but it was trying to sort out crosstalk because everybody interrupts everybody. And it was just a way of sort of recognizing voice patterns and kind of splitting those texts up instead of overlapping them. It's, I think it was Stephen Gould wrote a book called Talk, 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 saying that people don't talk the way they think they do. And he said, if you transcribe most conversations, they're kind of gibberish. But we sort through them. So this was, these were algorithms to try and separate the speech out. And when those is and just start, it would fix that for you. Thanks, everybody. I think that's it. I'm sure these conversations will continue. But we've got some good ideas out of this, I think.